proud to be here to say thank you to the Equality Caucus and the other sponsors for putting this convention together and for the work that you have done, particularly Equality Illinois. For the last 25 years, you have been really the leading organization in this fight for full LGBT equality here in Illinois under a simple but a very powerful goal, until we're all equal, which is, says it all. It's great to be back in Chicago, and my chief of staff, who has roots here, is happy to be back as well. And it's important to note that while I think lots of people think the gay rights movement started in New York City, you will probably all know this, that it actually, like so many other things, Chicago did it first, and even better, I would say. In 1924, in Old Town, Henry Gerber, who was a German immigrant, a U.S. Army veteran, and an openly gay man, founded the Society for Human Rights, which was the first gay rights organization in America. Just a year later, his home was raided by members of the Chicago Police Department. He was never convicted of a crime, but the ordeal cost him his job at a post office along with his life savings, and he soon left Chicago for New York City, where he continued his advocacy for gay rights for gay Americans until his death in 1972. And in many ways, Henry Gerber was really decades ahead of his time, and the discrimination that he experienced from neighbors, colleagues, and even his own government demonstrated the incredible difficulties that our movement would face in the decades to follow. And when you consider that in 1952, the American Psychiatric Association classified homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance. And a year later, President Eisenhower signed an executive order that banned gays from working for the federal government. And both the diagnosis and this executive order remained in place for 20 years. In 1982, just to give you some comparisons, just 32% of Americans felt that same-sex relationships should be legal. And in 1996, only 27% of Americans thought that marriages between same-sex couples should be equal in the eyes of the law. But despite these really serious early obstacles, as Jan said, we have really made tremendous progress. Thanks to millions of citizens all across this country, organizations like Equality Illinois, like individuals like the people in this room, we've really been able to make progress and build on the very kind of early work of Henry Gerber that started right here in Illinois. This state was the first state to decriminalize homosexuality in 1962. And in 1974, Kathy Konschenko won a seat on the Ann Arbor City Council in Michigan, becoming the first out politician to win an election. That was in 1974. In 1980, the Democratic Party endorsed a national party platform to advance gay rights. 36 years later, we're still waiting for our friends on the other side of the aisle to catch up. The way things are going this year, it might be another 36 years before they come around to that. But it's really because of the incredible work of lots of people who have devoted so much energy to this movement that lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals are no longer regarded as second-class citizens in this country. But I would say that perhaps the most significant contribution that Chicago and the state of Illinois has made to support the movement of equality for the LGBT community is the election of Barack Obama as a United States Senator that allowed him to have a platform to become President of the United States. There is no question that President Obama is the most consequential president in the history of LGBT equality. And he's really, I don't think we as a community sort of take stock of it often enough. During his 7 years in office, and he's still going as of today, he signed the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act to strengthen the prosecution of hate crimes at the state and local level. He forced a Republican Congress to send him a reauthorization for the Violence Against Women Act that included, for the first time ever, protections for LGBT victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. He's appointed many members of our community to important and visible positions of responsibility in his administration. He ended a 17-year ban on lesbian, gays, and bisexuals serving openly in the military. He ended the policy of discharging transgendered soldiers because of their gender identity. He appointed 2 Supreme Court justices who are protecting, in a very visible way, LGBT rights. He required health insurers to offer transition-related health coverage for federal employees. And today's administration, as Jan mentioned, is directing every public school district in the United States to allow transgender students to use facilities consistent with their gender identity. This is an extraordinary amount of progress, and the last 7 years, the leadership that our president has provided has been really impactful for our community in so many ways. And for me, it has been a special honor to be in Congress at a time that we have a president that is so committed to full equality for our community. I think we just have to recognize that, and particularly as the threat, at least, of having a president who maybe doesn't share those values is presented to us. It's a particular moment, I think, to take stock of what President Obama has done. But I think we all recognize, despite that progress, that we have a lot of work to do, and I think when this convention ends, it will fall to all of us to really chart a path forward in this fight for full equality for our community. And there is still a lot of work to do in many places in this country. In particular, it is impossible for members of our community to live free from the fear of discrimination. It is, I think, surprising to most Americans that despite the decision of the United States Supreme Court on marriage equality, that in many places across America you can be married on Saturday, post your wedding pictures on Facebook on Sunday, and then be fired from your job or thrown out of your apartment on Monday just because of who you are. And despite an excellent decision that was referenced in the last panel last summer from the EEOC that's providing some protections against discrimination, members of the LGBT community are at risk of losing their jobs in 28 states because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. In 29 states, it's legal for a restaurant, library, or other facility that offers public services to turn away someone because they're a member of the LGBT community. Fortunately, these things are not true here in Illinois, but as an openly gay member of the United States Congress, I can legally be denied services in Ohio, Florida, Michigan, and 26 other states. And as we've seen in the past year, this situation in some parts of our country is actually getting worse. The new discriminatory laws in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Mississippi amount to nothing more than state-sanctioned discrimination. They purport to solve problems that in reality don't exist, and instead, really, their sole purpose is to permanently relegate the LGBT community to second-class status. Over the past year, there have been nearly 200 bills introduced in 34 states to expressly permit discrimination against the LGBT community. So this is a lot of activity, and a lot of people attempting really to undermine our full equality. They range from allowing religion to be used as an excuse for discrimination to laws denying transgender individuals the use of facilities consistent with their gender identity. And make no mistake about it, this is a well-coordinated, well-funded assault by a group of people who are really standing on the wrong side of history. What's worse is these new proposals and the lack of protections across the country, particularly the lack of federal protection from discrimination, have created an atmosphere where discrimination is not only tolerated, but often considered acceptable. Discrimination against the LGBT community is real. And every day, millions of members of our community are at risk of losing their jobs, being kicked out of their homes, or being denied services. And here are some facts in a recent study that was done. 1 out of every 10 lesbian, gay, and bisexual workers have been fired from a job because of their sexual orientation. 63% of LGBT Americans will experience discrimination at some point in their lives. 56% of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people have experienced discrimination trying to get health care, and 70% of transgender Americans report the same. And among LGBT students, 82% have been verbally harassed, 38% have been physically harassed, and 64% have felt unsafe at school because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. These numbers are staggering. And so when people say, what do we need all this legislation for? There's really no problem. This is a very recent report, and there's real discrimination against our community in numbers that should alarm everyone. And no American, no person who lives in this country should ever be made to feel less than equal. That is contrary to the founding principles of this great country. And Attorney General Loretta Lynch said just a few days ago, in a very kind of forceful challenge to the North Carolina discrimination law, this is about the dignity and respect we accord our fellow citizens and the laws that we as a people and as a country have enacted to protect them, indeed to protect all of us. And it's about the founding ideals that have led this country, halting but inexorably in the direction of fairness, inclusion, and equality for all Americans. And that's our Attorney General of the United States, which should not be lost on us. You know, that would have not necessarily been the words of Ed Meese and somebody who was long before you were born. But this remains a very real issue, and it is why I introduced the Equality Act. And I'm very proud to say that this is an act which has the support now of 174 members of the House. Of course, Jan Schakowsky was like the second one on the bill, like immediately. But it is, you know, it's a very comprehensive bill. As Jan mentioned, you know, there were legislative efforts to deal with employment and legislative efforts to deal with marriage. And I think many of us felt like, you know, we had come to a different time in the history of our movement and in the history of our country. And that it was time actually to once and for all, in a comprehensive way, forbid discrimination in any context. And so what the Equality Act does is it really expands the existing civil rights law, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and a number of other federal provisions to ensure that members of the LGBT community can live free from discrimination. It prohibits discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in employment, education, federal funding, housing, public accommodations, credit, and jury service. And what it does is it simply adds those categories, sexual orientation and gender identity. The benefit of that is that it's the architecture of the Civil Rights Act, which has many years of litigation, lots of interpretations, is thereby sort of adopted. We don't have to hopefully relitigate everything. The same exemptions and exceptions that exist for all the other categories should exist for the LGBT community, no more, no less. And fundamentally, it has to be embedded in the existing civil rights architecture. There are some people who argue, you know, couldn't you do a separate bill? Could you? And for all the obvious reasons, the answer is no. That for us to achieve full equality, those categories simply need to be added to the existing civil rights law. And it's really the only way to achieve full equality for our community. I'm very grateful that virtually every Democrat, we have a few more to get, will be on this bill. But despite the fact that it has that number of co-sponsors, we introduced it 9 months ago, the bill really remains trapped by the Republican House leadership, who have really refused both to bring this bill to the floor, to give us a hearing in the Judiciary Committee, or frankly to address any other legislation intended to confront LGBT discrimination. So, you know, Speaker Ryan talks a lot about making the Republican Party the party of opportunity and a big tent, and it would be a really easy way to match that rhetoric with some action by bringing this bill forward. And again, if there are people who intend to vote against it, they ought to have that right, and let them explain to their constituents why they think people who are members of the LGBT community should not be entitled to fair treatment and should be discriminated against, but let them be accountable for that position. But I'm afraid so far they have cowardly hidden behind this process and won't be forced to have a vote on it until we can rally some more external support and force them to do that. And we already know what the objections to the legislation will be. Some will argue that we have to respect religious liberty, and I want to just spend a minute on this because I know there's some discussion about this with the panel. This idea of we have to, you know, it's a bait and switch. Everyone hears religious freedom and we're all for that, and then they switch it with basically discrimination. The truth is, this argument, in my view, about religious freedom and religious exemptions actually don't exist in the context of LGBT equality, for the simple reason that it's an excuse to discriminate, and the reality is there is no religious tradition that has as a core teaching that it is appropriate to deny housing or food or employment to people who are lesbian or gay or bisexual or transgender. There is no such religious teaching. What they're really arguing is, well, it's a sin according to our religious teaching, and we should be allowed to discriminate against people who commit sins. That's really what they're saying. And of course, that doesn't make any sense because there's lots of sins in the Bible. For example, eating shellfish and using mixed fats. We don't deny someone a mortgage because they ate at Red Lobster. We don't kick someone out of school because they bought a wool and cotton blend at Old Navy. So I mean, you can't, we really have to unpack this, because I think even our own community, we sort of accept the idea that there's a religious exemption. There isn't. I mean, there is no teaching that says that that is an appropriate way as a core tenet. And so what they're really saying is, oh, but you're doing something that we consider a sin. And there are a whole number of examples of sins that everyone would agree you can't not hire somebody or kick someone out of their apartment because of that. And so I think we have to push back hard on this notion of religious exemption, because it's really an effort to discriminate and do it in the name of religious freedom, which is a deeply held belief, religious freedom, but it is a total bait and switch. And so we have to really respond to that argument forcefully when it's made. Second, they will attempt to, and we're seeing this happen today, they'll try to ignite opposition by invoking, of course, the very difficult bathroom question, which, Jan was so right. It was just amazing to have, the Democratic caucus be discussing, like, how do we deal with this issue of bathrooms, which, of course, is not an issue at all. And, there's this whole argument of somehow, you're going to endanger the lives of little girls if trans. I mean, it is so deeply offensive. And by the way, I've got news for the people who make this argument. If that's the standard, members of Congress are probably a bigger threat than the transgender community. Because in the last 20, 40 years, there's not been a single transgender person that has been charged for a crime that occurred while using a public restroom. But 2 members of Congress have. Larry Craig, who you might remember from getting in trouble in the Minneapolis airport bathroom a few years ago, and John Hinson, a congressman from Mississippi in 1981. So actually, there hasn't been any evidence of a transgender person in 40 years, but 2 members of Congress. So this is, of course, a ridiculous argument, and it really does belittle in a very fundamental way the serious challenges that members of the LGBT community, particularly the trans community, face every day. And this is sort of the only thing they have, which is why they've resorted to this. But they're on the wrong side of history. They will fail ultimately. Since our country was founded, we have always marched toward this ideal that all Americans are entitled to equality under the law. It hasn't been an easy process. It hasn't always been happened quickly, but fairness and equality are core values that unite us as Americans. And we're at a really critical point in this fight for our community. And I am confident that history is not going to look kindly on those who stood in the way of progress and of equality. And the time for leadership, both in our community and outside of community, is now to really affirm our belief in the importance of fairness and equality for all Americans. And I want to just share one story. When we were putting together this coalition to introduce the Equality Act, one of the first people that I went to was Congressman John Lewis, who you all know is a legend. I mean, it's one of those moments like when you get to work, you're like, I'm working with John Lewis. You sort of pinch yourself. And he was someone who organized sit-ins at the lunch counters. He served as chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He walked along with Dr. King, and when he was only 25 years old, he marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And that peaceful march ended when state troopers viciously beat and fractured his skull and almost killed him. And at that moment, we saw kind of the worst that we've ever seen of humanity. But John Lewis never wavered in his commitment that no amount of force could drive out truth and justice, and he remained incredibly committed to the idea of equality and social justice. And so I enlisted John early in this fight, and I remember we were in a meeting with some folks who were trying to suggest to us that maybe we should slow down the introduction. It was kind of a big step, and could we break the bill up into 5 different parts, and couldn't it be its own bill, and maybe we should just sort of slow down. And I'm trying to make my case, but then John Lewis stands up, in this voice of God, and he says, this is exactly what they told me in 1964, to wait and be patient. This is 2016. We have to be brave and bold, and we must do this now. It's like, I have nothing else to say. But it was just a reminder of this sort of common struggle, and that we owe to people like John Lewis and so many people in our own community who for many decades have been fighting for equality, and we're building this movement really on their work. And we have to develop the same kind of culture in this country in which, nobody would think that it's appropriate for a restaurant to turn away a black family because they're black. It's repugnant. Nobody would think that you could deny a woman employment because she's Jewish. Those are things which are deeply ingrained in the kind of psyche of this country now. We have to do the same thing for LGBT people. The same sort of revulsion when you hear about this kind of discrimination has to be created, and I think we're doing that. The one final thing I want to say, and Jan mentioned this in her remarks, that as we continue the fight for full equality for our own community, with passage of the Equality Act, I think it's incredibly important that we be good partners in the work for social justice and for progress on a number of issues. We need the support of our allies, and they deserve to have our support. And so it's really important as a community that we be good and effective partners in the work. And we need to be strong advocates for women's rights and reproductive rights and labor rights and voting rights, and be very loud and clear that Black lives matter, and be very loud and clear in demanding criminal justice reform and the end of mass incarceration. We have to be, this is an important fight for our community and one we're going to focus a lot on, but we have to also be really good partners with others who are going to be key in our success in passing the Equality Act and realizing full equality for our own community, but also in supporting other issues that are really important to the kind of world that we want to live in. And I think despite the urgency and kind of the personal nature of our fight, it's really important that we be good partners with so many other groups doing really important work. And I have no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that we will pass the Equality Act. It will be the law of the land. We will live in a country where it is illegal to discriminate against people based on sexual orientation or gender identity. The only question is how quickly we get to that point. And it's our collective responsibility to get there as quickly as we can to make that period as short as possible. And I know you're all doing that in many different ways. So.